Well, hi everybody. It's meteorologist Joe Chaffee on this Sunday, 5:30 p.m. The good thing when the Giants and the Jets play at the same time is that you can get the two losses done simultaneously and you're finished. It's not like you're watching 6 hours of agony. You have to pick and choose which game you want, or you can watch one on one TV and one on a mobile device or vice versa or multiple devices. Bottom line is they're done, it's over with, and the agony has for another year has ended. Meanwhile, we have agony going on amongst the snow lovers out there who 9 days into the winter season have already proclaimed the winter dead and over with. It really is astounding to me that people can actually say that, given the experiences of the winters of the last several years, which have played out with so many surprises along the way in both directions. Who would have thought last year, after having a bitter cold December and early January, followed by a very warm mid January to late February, that you wound up then having an almost unprecedented March with nor'easters and cold relative to the time of year, of course. You go back to the El Nino year of 15-16, and you had a one of the biggest snowstorms ever in the east for many locations in the middle of January, and after that, there were even some surprises inside a warm pattern in a December where we were at 70 on Christmas Day here in the New York City area. Then go back to the winters before that, 14, 15 in particular, which was really didn't get started until the middle of January, and it got kicked off by what has become known as the infamous half blizzard back on, I believe, January 24th, 2015, where a huge blizzard was forecast and only for the coastal Northeast, and some areas got completely shut out. It was literally a wall from zero to, as it usually is. You go a matter of miles to go from a dusting to a foot. But that kicked off a stretch of cold and snow that lasted till the end of March. So, unless you really have a meteorological basis for saying that, if you can come back to me with an argument that says, well, this is why I think this is going to be the case, the upper air is this, the ocean water temperatures are that, the El Nino is in such a state. I can accept that. The rest of it is just emotional frustration, and that doesn't really tell me anything, and it shouldn't tell you anything. The point is, could this wind up being subpar? Of course. There are whole sorts of things that we don't quite get or understand in terms of dealing with the long range, and that's why I stay out of the long range prediction part of it. I just want to, basically we focus on what is and maybe what can be or might be in the short range to medium range going out a week or two. And then after that, you let the chips fall where they may. So we are closing out 2018 on a very wet note. A number of places vaulting into the top five of wettest years. Some places over the last couple of days have joined the list of cities where annual rainfalls are hitting all-time records. Some places are going to fall just short. Atlanta was one, as one of our regulars, Doug Crum, messaged me yesterday about the fact that Atlanta now, its wettest year on record, with not a whole lot of a tropical influence getting involved, which is pretty unusual. But bottom line is, it is a wet year. It was a wet year, and the pattern remains wet to start the new year. So I'm going to start with WPC's rainfall forecast for the next 7 days. We have an event coming up for Monday and for Monday night when the new year arrives. At the infamous dropping of the ball at Times Square, it's going to be raining, and it might even be raining hard, depending on how the heaviest rain, how it times out. But over the next 7 days, we've got another weather system for later in the week. There's a ton of uncertainty with that and how that's going to play out. But the rainfall, the liquid rainfall amounts in the east, totaling about 1.5 to 2.5 inches throughout much of New England. back down to the New York State line. It gets a little more patchy after that, but every bit of an inch and a quarter to an inch and a half. And I think the event for tomorrow night is going to be a 3/4 of an inch to an inch type system, and then you have amounts of 3 inches or more: northern Louisiana, northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, southern Tennessee. That is going to be with the what's going through developing now for tonight into tomorrow, and then of course you have the system for later in the week. Rains up and down California for a change on the order of about an inch and a quarter to an inch and a half all the way down to San Diego, and then running up the immediate coast, and then it picks up again in western Washington. Also in the southwest, and so a lot of this is going to wind up being snow, especially in the mountains in Arizona, New Mexico, down into Colorado, Utah, on up through Wyoming and into southeastern Montana. And then you've got a band of a half an inch to 3/4, and that's coming as snow. Some of that's going to be happening on Monday across the plains, and we've got all sorts of advisories and watches and warnings that are coming out. We also have some thunderstorm activity, although not severe weather going on, but we do have an area of thunderstorms, and this is again being generated by the system that's coming out for Monday. Starting to see radar echoes with some heavier rains popping up across the lower Mississippi Valley back into eastern Texas, but no organized areas of severe weather expected for the overnight at least. Now, we'll get the window up, and we'll start getting going. We're gonna by the way, going to do a little bit of interesting stuff with the long range when we get to it. I'm going to talk about the splitting of the vortex and all the rest of it, and we will cover that extensively, because I've got some thoughts on some stuff that's been going around with regards to folks trying to figure out what exactly is happening at the moment. And I kind of think they possibly may be barking up the wrong tree. I'm not sure. But here are our watches and warnings that are up for tonight. We've got a lot of winter storm warnings up in the northern Rockies and extending into the western plains. Advisories going east into Minnesota. We've got winter storm watches up again for much of the state of New Mexico. Advisories and a couple of winter storm warnings into Colorado and also into eastern Arizona. We've got some winter storm warnings up there and advisories for about the eastern half of the state. Same goes for Utah. Looking at advisories up for parts of upstate New York and northern New England, and this is for later tomorrow into tomorrow night. There will be some snow in central and northern Vermont, central and northern New Hampshire, much of Maine, and we've got winter storm watches up for the north. I never know how exactly to describe that part of Maine, but I guess that's the northern half of Maine under a winter storm watch. Some advisories up around the Great Lakes, and we've got a few areas that are dealing with some dense fog this evening in the southeast. So that is a bit of a problem there, and some wind issues going on along the west coast. There's a really bitter cold air mass that is coming down out of Canada that's going to be moving into the plains. And I don't know if you can see this all too well. Otherwise, you're going to have to trust me. I'll get a little closer. But behind this Arctic boundary that is now running across northern Montana, northern North Dakota, and northern Minnesota, you've got temperatures that go pretty far down below zero. I saw some numbers this morning at about 30 or 40 below. And as we go further north into Canada, you start going north and west of Lake Winnipeg, and you start to see temperatures right now at minus 26, minus 27, minus 33. So this is a pretty cold high that's coming down, that's going to be pushing into the plains. And of course, we're going to have the snow that will result. Meanwhile, ahead of it, it's in the 40s across Nebraska. We've got 40s in Colorado. So it's fairly warm. In the east, we actually had a little bit of a cheap thrill snow this morning, which was a bit of a surprise to me. This was the weak shortwave energy back earlier this week. Some models were doing some things with it, kind of disappeared. Slight hints of it yesterday. I didn't think it was really worth mentioning, but we wound up with a few snowflakes flying around this morning, and we stayed with a lot of clouds. Meanwhile, temperatures today, because of the clouds, had a tough time getting much out of the 30s and low 40s, and that's where we are right now. The area you go up upstate and into New England, we are in the 20s and even some teens. And back through the Great Lakes, we're in the 30s. Not a whole lot of weather going on there. And of course, with this warm front that's setting up down in the southeast, you've got the dense fog that is being observed in parts of North Georgia and South Carolina, while in the warm tropical air on the south of the warm front, and you're looking at dew points in the upper 60s and temperatures right now that are in the mid 70s to lower 80s as you head southward down into into Florida. On the radar, this is as of 5:40 Eastern time, seeing the beginnings of that moisture being generated through East Texas and into Louisiana and Arkansas with some moderate to heavy rain. Also seeing some snow up in parts of South Dakota, northern Minnesota, up through Montana and back up into parts of Idaho and northern Utah and Nevada, and a little bit of precip coming into the Pacific Northwest as things start gelling up. So let's take a look at what's going to be happening going forward. I'm going to set the NAM up here. Hang on one second, folks. We'll get this map in order. Our maps are courtesy of tropicaltidbits.com. Should be your go-to site for weather models. Best site around, in my opinion. Okay, and let's get started. So first off, we actually have this system that is coming out, low pressure, that is running up way to the west. I mean, it's going into southern Indiana. And as a result, you're seeing rains extending up the Mississippi Valley with some heavy rains on Monday across southeastern Missouri into southern Illinois, through central Indiana, and into northwest Ohio. The low center is actually going to go into southern Michigan. The Arctic boundary, as it sinks southward, I'm going to just run it back. You can see how the snow expands in this sort of east-west band from central Minnesota to Lake Superior, back to central Minnesota, and across South Dakota with that big 1045 high plunging down. That's that bitter cold air. And much of that cold air, as it comes down, is going to go more to the south than it is to the east because of where the trough is. And you'll see it on the upper air, why that plays out that way. This low is going to run up. Now, we've got a warm front that's coming up the East Coast, so there'll be some rain that develops ahead of it. There's not a whole lot being indicated for the interior mid-Atlantic and into the southeast out of this. This looks like, because of the fact that there's actually a ridge in the eastern part of the United States, and not the most impressive shortwave in the world. You could barely find it on the upper air maps. And I'm not expecting much in the way of rain going down into the southeast or even up into the interior mid-Atlantic. You're really going to see it get going as you get into Pennsylvania, Maryland, northern Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, southern New England, and then on north and east from there as the warm front sets up. And that front is going to go through here. So we're going to get into some warm temperatures briefly late Monday night and on Tuesday. Rising temperatures Monday night for New Year's Eve. It'll be raining for the ball drop. Actually, it might be raining pretty hard. The GFS actually has a bit of a precipitation max being indicated there over Long Island and back over toward New York City between 7 p.m. and 1 a.m. Monday night into Tuesday. Meanwhile, snow, perhaps some steady or heavier snow across Wisconsin on up through northern Michigan, and also, as we said, northern Vermont, northern New Hampshire, and for the northern part of Maine, as that low runs out to the northeast. And now, of course, you've got this high. Again, more of the cold air. If you look at where those blue dashed lines are, the thickness lines, okay, as you watch that high come down, the blue line, the blue dashed lines, the thickness lines, push more to the south into Texas than they actually do in the east. It's more of a direct push of cold air southward and more of a bleed through amount of cold air into the east. So we will have some leftover upper 50s and even 60s here on Tuesday before the cold air really takes hold, which will be on Wednesday and Wednesday night. It's not a big push here. it is basically takes you back down to near normal. And now, once again, we have a wave of low pressure that's going to develop on the stalled frontal boundary, much like what's happening here tonight for Monday night. It's going to happen again for Wednesday night and Thursday. The models are having trouble again figuring out the depth of the upper air feature. The GFS has been splitting the energy, and the European has been holding it back. And it has one more stronger, more intense feature, which comes out later in the period rather than have this come out in two separate pieces. If you get a precip to run out ahead on Thursday, it might be cold enough for some snow at the start for places in southeastern New York and southern New England, maybe to about New York City and northern New Jersey and northeastern PA and Long Island before that area just goes out, and then you run out of cold air. Because if you notice up along the Canadian border, the problem here is you've got westerly isobars here. Okay, there's another low that's moving across southern Canada. There's no high that's holding in New England to keep the cold air pinned into the east. So that makes things problematic with regards to having enough cold air for any kind of frozen precip. The GFS wants to keep the second system, rather weak. He takes some rain out Thursday night and Friday, develops a low south of Nova Scotia, and then it moves along to the northeast and actually produces a fair amount of snow for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick by the end of the week. We're looking at the 18Z GFS, which is just out. So I'm looking at it for the first time. I haven't seen it this far, so I'm seeing it with you. Later next, we get this push of colder, slightly colder air behind it in the northeast and mid-Atlantic, but much of the southeast and the Ohio and Tennessee Valley going back into the plains is actually going to be quite mild here with the Pacific air coming in. And then notice a lot of tropical moisture shooting into California coming up from the south at next weekend. If this is right, you've got some kind of low that looks like it originates from the tropical Pacific someplace that rides up northeastward and moves into Southern California with some very heavy rains. You're gonna have to watch to see how, but if that's real or not. It certainly looks like some kind of tropical feed of some kind that gets involved here for next weekend and brings some heavy snows up into the mountains in interior Eastern California, and you go into parts of Nevada, but it floods warmer air out into the west. But meanwhile, you do have another cold front coming through in the east with a high coming down. The GFS around day 8, day 9 actually has a fairly decent shot of cold air, if you want to believe it. And then that high kind of parks in along the east coast. So then it goes out, and after that, I don't know. So we're going to look and see what the upper air is doing. So let's try and do a little figuring here. And then we're going to talk about the stratospheric warm-up and where this is all going, or where it might go. I think that's probably the better view of this. Part of the problem here is the fact that you've got this, the Pacific is a mess. You have this screaming fire hose jet. If you look at all the height lines that are out in the Pacific north of Hawaii, this almost straight west to east flow toward the west coast, and that's always problematic. It tends to want to overwhelm things when it gets into the U.S. You do have later this week, with this trough in the east that pulls out, then that lifts up. But it does look like it wants to get at least some troughing there in the eastern part of Canada to keep the eastern U.S. cold, the northeastern part of the U.S. cold for the middle of next week. And I'm noticing higher than normal pressures building up across Greenland and Iceland, which is probably going to contribute to some kind of negative NAO, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going into the icebox anytime soon. And that trough sort of pulls out, and by the time we get to, this is by January 9th or 10th, you're back to more of a Pacific flow. There is a polar flow in Canada, but it doesn't come far enough south, so it probably would keep the air pinned along the Canadian border. We'll come back to it because it's not done yet. I want to see where it goes in the last stretch of days. Now I want to take a look. We're going to talk a little bit of the long range with this stratospheric, the polar vortex and the stratosphere splitting. And I'll back it up because we're at day 11 here. So this is after the split is done. The split's going to happen, okay? So we're at the point now where the process is already underway. This is a major league attack of the polar vortex in the stratosphere. And when we move this along, we are now at today. You can see how that upper low, that the vortex is getting stretched apart, and by Tuesday night, Wednesday, the vortex begins to split. One upper low migrates back to Siberia. Another one, the other one, drops down into the northeastern, into southeastern Canada, northern New England, and just sits there. And actually, just trying to see here, it holds its own in terms of strength going through this forecast period. And look at that, it actually even strengthens a bit as we're now at day 11 into the long range. The other vortex has moved into deeper into Siberia. So it's a complete split with the upper high that's over Western Canada kind of nosing its way toward the North Pole and into northern Greenland. So what does this mean? Well, let me take a copy of this picture and we'll put it up on the paint box. And again, this is, I want to just emphasize it. I've said this a few times here in the last week or so. This is this is the first winter. I mean, I have looked at this stuff from time to time in the last couple of winters, but this is one where I'm really paying close attention and I'm learning. Okay, this is when this is all said and done, it's going to certainly be revealing in terms of the learning experience that it has evolved into. Okay, so how is this supposed to work? Well, if you look at this level of the atmosphere, there's a layer between the stratosphere and the bottom of the atmosphere. It's called the tropopause. Okay, when thunderstorms in the summertime, when they're tops, we like to know at what level the tropopause is. So let's just arbitrarily pick a spot. Let's say the tropopause is at 45,000 feet. When the tops of those thunderstorms break through that 45,000 foot line where the tropopause is and extend up from there, that's usually the point. That is the point where these thunderstorms become severe, when they break the trope. Okay. In this instance, what we're looking to see if it happens is, while all of this is going on in the stratosphere, you've got the atmosphere under the bottom part of the atmosphere where we are, under the tropopause, kind of behaving in its own way. So the question is whether the impact of this warming event is it going to break through the tropopause and impact the bottom part of the atmosphere. So if we follow the flow, so here are your lows. Okay, here's your vortex. Here's your split vortex here. You've got the upper high out over northwestern Canada. So if you look at this in terms of where the flow is, you would see air moving in this direction. So this is the idea, is that if the influence of what's going on in the stratosphere winds up exerting itself in the bottom of the atmosphere, you're going to bring cold air masses down from the polar regions down through central and eastern Canada and into the eastern part of the United States. This is kind of what we saw when this happened mid-February last year, when the polar vortex split, and it brought colder than normal conditions down through the east. And of course, we had the nor'easters that went with it. The stormy part of this equation is the part that probably has the greater variability, because there are other factors at play here when it comes to that. So this is probably more a focus on the cold. The snow question is going to be a whole different ballgame. But I think we've resolved the fact that the split is going to happen. It's going to happen in a very bullish way for cold air, at least in theory. Now the question is waiting for the short-term models to catch up and figure out, whether this is all going to extend down to the bottom of the atmosphere. This process is not something that is where basically flip a switch and suddenly it's wintertime. It doesn't work that way. We had the split last year in the middle of February. We really didn't see it evident for yeah, if I'm using my memory here, which might be a bit faulty, but I seem to remember that it really didn't start to show up in the models until late in the month of February. So it took a good 10 days for it to play out in the models. And then it started to play out in terms of the practical weather as soon as the calendar turned into the month of March. And then it got deeper and deeper with each subsequent nor'easter that went by. So the split is going to be playing its role. The other thing I wanted to look at tonight, because this is being tossed around as far as what's happening at the moment. Why have we not seen snow every single day since November 1st? I'm approaching that question from the standpoint of the snow weenies out there who have already committed. They're already lining up along the metaphoric bridge about to make the leap. It's really so silly. We've had so many winters in the last number of years that have gotten started, that basically have gotten started late. This one didn't really get started late because we had a cold November and first half of December relative to normal. So I'm not sure. I honestly wish there was a way to adjust the expectations of these folks, because it's so needless in terms of the emotional suffering that they put themselves through. Okay, but I want to take a look at this because a lot of people are bringing up the El Nino and that it's strong and this is what's causing all the problems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, well, let's take a look at this. This is what it looks like right now. This is probably the last sea surface temperature anomaly map that we're going to see while the government shutdown is going on, because this is considered non-essential, so they're out furloughed. But this is what the water temperature profile looks like across the Pacific. And at least along the equator, we do have above average temperatures that have developed now, extending from South America right out to Hawaii. And then it continues across the entire Pacific basin out to the West Pacific. You've got pockets of colder than average water temperatures up to the north. The waters off the Gulf of Alaska and around the Aleutians remain warm. On the Atlantic side, you're seeing, let me just center this a bit better. On the Atlantic side, you're seeing water temperatures that are generally cooler than average north of 40 degrees north, with some warm pockets in between. Warmer than average south of 35 degrees north, with some cold pockets and a little bit of cold water out in the tropical regions. Okay, so this is right now in for 2018. This is as of December 27th, 2018. But I want to go back to 2015 when we had the raging El Nino, and I mean, here we have really big anomalies of warm water that developed in the tropical Pacific from South America, extending out to the international date line. And you actually had cooler than average temperatures in parts of the Western Pacific. So if you look at the difference here, there's a notable difference between this water temperature profile and this water temperature profile. Also, in the east, it was raging warm because of the very warm weather that we had. Record warm November and December, if I remember. It was all-time record. Certainly, I know it was an all-time record. Busted the temperature for all-time record warm for December by almost 10 degrees in New York City. But we had record warm water temperatures here in the east. So here it is now, and here it is back in 2015. The El Nino was so strong here, and east-based El Nino here was so powerful that it basically overwhelmed everything. It took complete control, was in complete control of the upper air pattern that was happening. We had no vortex split that year either. So that's a big difference. We have a much weaker El Nino now than we did back in 15. So I don't know where I've seen few people calling this a strong El Nino. I wouldn't call this a strong El Nino. This was a strong El Nino. So I'm not, while the El Nino is probably playing a role, you didn't have a split in the vortex in the stratosphere going on at the end of December. And by the way, this went into January of 16, where the weather pattern did take about a 2-week break, and inside of that was one of the biggest snowstorms, as I said earlier, that the East ever had. But let's look back a bit further. I want to go back to 2014, which is kind of interesting. This is December of 2014, which, if you recall, I mentioned earlier, this uh, the winter really didn't. It waited till the middle of January, and then it was unrelenting through February and through March in terms of the cold. So this was a winter where it took a while for it to get going. So if you look across the Pacific, you do have warmer than average temperatures. Not a big area, but you do have some areas here where the temperatures were generally warmer than average across the Pacific from one end to the other. So here is this year's um, the area across the equatorial Pacific, 2018, and here we are at 2014. So let me make sure you guys are seeing this okay. I want to make sure the map is centered. Okay, so again, 2018 on the Pacific side, 2015, 2014. 2014 doesn't look all that different from 2018, if you ask me. 2018, 2014. On the Atlantic side, let's focus on that. So here's 2014 on the Atlantic, and here's 2018. I mean, there are some notable differences. In 14, looks like the water was a bit colder out in the Atlantic north of 40, but it does sort of match up with some of the below normal temperatures that existed there. So if at least on the Pacific side, granted, this was probably a neutral Nino here at this point, a neutral ENSO. So we have a weak El Nino now, or borderline weak El Nino, according to the Weather Service. I don't know if they've upgraded it or not. I didn't see anything. But again, uh, that to me, the water temperature profile of 18 looks more like December of 14 than it doesn't look anything at all like the raging El Nino of 15. Now I'm going to go back to 2010, because this year, this is being thrown up with the split of the stratospheric of the stratospheric vortex, because um, I saw references made to the split in 2010, which was it was cold and it was snowy, at least for a time. I believe, if I remember correctly, the winter kind of shut down in the middle of February after that. But look how cold the Pacific was. I mean, this is sort of the opposite here. It looks like you had a raging La Nina going on across the equatorial Pacific in 2010. Uh, I don't know statistically where that all lies. And I went back now and I looked at 2009. Now, 09-10 was a cold and snowy winter for the East. There's a lot of blocking in that winter as well. There was a lot of blocking in the winter of 10-11 caused by a split in the vortex. But you look at the water temperatures across the Pacific along the equator, they actually look warmer here than they do this year. So I'm not really convinced that this is an El Nino issue that's going on right now. There's probably other factors at play. I don't think it's an El Nino issue. And I pulled up one other year, and this was 2006, and the winter of 06-07 was, from the standpoint of cold and snow, was not any, wasn't at all, at least from what I remember. And here's another instance where you have sort of this narrow band of warmer than normal temperatures along the equator, colder than normal temperatures out in the Northeast Pacific, and down all the way down into the areas south of 20 degrees north into the tropical Pacific. Now, I didn't really look very close about what else was going on in that particular winter, but again, I'm illustrating this because I'm really leaning to the idea here that if you're thinking that it's because of the warm, quote unquote, the El Nino situation in the Pacific, uh, yeah, I think it might be exerting a short-term influence of some kind, but I don't believe it's the only it's the only thing that's going on. And now, of course, we're going to have to wait and see how this plays out with the splitting of the vortex in the stratosphere, which, by the way, right through the 16-day period is in going strong here as we get into the middle of the month. So if we allow for a lag time of about 10 days to 2 weeks, the process has already begun. So we'll probably should start to see weather models reacting to this soon. It may take, we may start to see it show up in its long range, maybe in a few days, if it is going to extend down to the bottom part of the atmosphere. And well, I don't want to draw any conclusions now because we're only going to see this in the latter part of the forecast period. I want to see, if you look at the upper air here, okay, so after day 12 and 13, all of a sudden you start to get what looks like troughing here in the east and ridging up the west, and the whole Pacific repairs itself. All right, so I'll tell you what, when we start to see this show up inside the 10-day period, and it remains consistent through the rest of its long range, we can start to think that, well, maybe this pattern is the change is finally getting underway. But until then, I would be highly suspect, at least for the next. I mean, you do have a little, you get these cold shots that come into the east, but they're going to be transient. But the model, at least from this run late in the period, does apparently start to do a repair job. Let's see as we go through this week if we start to see this consistency every day. All right, we'll make a deal on that. I'm not. We're not going to draw any conclusions with regards to what we're seeing at the moment. So let me just come back to the board here. Bring this down to the bottom. Well, we got a nice crowd tonight. That's always good to see. Yes, do not worry, Snow Weenie, Scott Briller. I think that's very good advice. Let's see. Let's see. Here we go. I'm just checking all your comments here. 80-degree water temperatures in Huntington Beach, California is rare and happens this summer. Red Star, you're talking about off of LA? That would be almost unheard of, I would think. By the way, for those of you, if you want to look at these charts, it's very easy to find if you just Google them. Just go, I Googled Pacific sea surface temperature anomalies, and the very first link is there from the website that has this information. And can I go back to it? See if I can. I'll put the link up here. It's opso.noaa.gov, and I'll put the link up on the board. And they've got data going back many years. You can pull it up. They usually update these maps every 2 or 3 days. But again, because of the government shutdown, this is probably the last one we're going to see. I'm not an analog guy to speak of, Izzy D. I think analogs, they're useful to a certain degree, but nothing ever plays out exactly the same. And I think it's sometimes folks put too much faith in analogs. But the water temperature profile of 14-15 was not that different from what we're seeing now. I just don't think that the developing El Nino, whatever you're seeing there in the Pacific right now, it's probably playing a role in the weather pattern we're in. I just not would equate it to what I just would not equate it to the one that was back in 15-16. polar vortex. Polar vortex. Well, look, Earl Warren, the polar vortex is a real thing. It's just that it's been distorted in terms of what its function is. Okay, it's not some mega storm that develops and comes down and just you know. Uh, I'm trying to think of an almost cartoonish description with regards to a big cloud with a face on it blowing cold air all over the United States. It's a cyclone, it's a cyclone, or it could be several cyclones in the upper layers of the atmosphere. It isn't a new invention, but it's always been there. I you know, as far as the politics of and the conversations in the politics that wind up getting discussed out of all of this, it's just not relevant to me. I'm a weather guy. We're talking weather, we're talking forecasting, and that's really kind of where I'm at. Hey, Southside Boxing, how are you doing? You haven't been on in a while, and I see Joyce here. Maybe we could take a look at the weather going on in Europe. JS Sweetie, nice to see you. You've been away for a while. I got some of the old regulars are back tonight. That's a good thing. So why don't we take a look? I think I will take a look at the weather across Europe. Um, you've got Robert Hurley. You're going to have part of that vortex is going to go into Europe, and you're going to see it play out there. How it plays out remains to be seen. But I haven't really spent a whole lot of time. I've been looking at Europe the last couple of days. I picked up on a few things that are going on. So since we're on the subject matter, let's take a look and see what's happening, because the polar vortex, the other half, is going to be going to the European side. So folks there are going to have some impact there. So let's take a look. Getting a little repetitive here. Sorry about that. I'm just going to do, this is kind of a cursory view here of the GFS. Hang on, that's not all rain. Okay, I had the wrong parameter set. Actually, what we could start with is we'll start with the upper air. And right now, you've got this big, huge upper high over uh, France and England and Ireland, just sitting in place, this big ridge, which kind of stays there uh, into the middle of this week. And you have this strong upper low that drops down into Northern Europe and drops southward through Central Europe down toward the Mediterranean there. That's a big plunging upper low. So you're going to probably have a cold flow from Siberia that's going to sweep southward across Poland, and on through Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, down into Italy and into the Mediterranean. That upper high just sits there over England all week long, and then it finally begins to break down to some degree going into the second weekend of the first full weekend of the new year. Now we're into the week of January 6th, 7th, and I'm just trying to see still a lot of cold air. That's the coldest air is probably more inland in Europe rather than toward the coastal areas. And then the flow kind of normalizes a bit toward mid-month. You start to see stuff coming in from the east. So let's see where, how this plays out from the standpoint of practical weather. Well, for one thing, you're not getting much rain out of this around you in England and Ireland with this upper high that's sitting overhead. You can see where all the cold air is. The cold air is further east and coming down into east, Norway, Sweden, Finland, but particularly going into Poland, Germany. That's pretty cold, and there's some kind of low here with that plunging upper low. You get a low that forms. Got even some snows down into Italy, down into southern Italy. That's pretty impressive, and some snow down to Sicily in 5 days. Doesn't happen too often there, but the coldest air is east of Western Europe here, and it's going more in the east. You can see how the northerlies are kind of setting up there with the isobars, and how the snow areas that are moving from north to south. and then the more normalized flow as you get toward the end of the period. So it looks like you've got some dry times here this week here in England and Ireland. Not too much happening here this week until that upper high breaks down. That's going to keep things pretty quiet out your way. Just want to take a look at temperatures. Let me do that. In terms of below and above average. So with that upper low, so here we are. So this is now, we're at Wednesday. So you have below average temperatures, but the really strong anomalies, look at down in Italy, you're talking about 20 degrees or more below average down along the Mediterranean into Greece. I wonder if this is one of those situations where they wind up seeing snow in places like Athens and Rome, which they don't see snow too often. But most of the cold anomalies are going to be more south and east than they are going to be north and west. Although there are, we do see some below normal temperature patterns, patches here from day to day in Western Europe, but that's going to be accompanied by dry weather and then a real cold push into Siberia and into Eastern Europe as we get to the latter part of the forecast period. So there's your impact. If that upper vortex is going to wind up, if that polar vortex on the stratosphere is going to wind up moving more towards Siberia and going to the east, you're going to see the push of cold air perhaps being eventually being further east rather than in the west. I'm going to want to make sure I check it every day because since the vortex is splitting on both, splitting in two, it's going to be having impacts on both sides of the globe. So this is going to be important to keep an eye on. Not quite the beast of the east in this particular setup like we had last year. All right, so you know what? We're going to call it a night at this point. Thanks very much for being here tonight. Covered a lot of stuff with the precipitation coming up for Monday and into Tuesday, and then whatever's going to happen later this week. I'm still, there's a lot of uncertainty with regards to the next weather system for late this week. So we'll wait till tomorrow. We'll start to pay close attention to how that is all going to play out. All right, so everyone, I want to make sure I will be on regular time. I'm working tomorrow and Tuesday, so I will be doing my regular YouTube live stream on both those days. We'll shoot for 7 o'clock Eastern time, and leave it at that. And I'm working all week, so it's just back to normal, 7 o'clock Eastern time live streams. Just make sure you have a safe holiday for New Year's. Travel safely. Don't take chances. Don't drink and drive. Just travel safely. Have a great time and a happy New Year. That's pretty much it. So have a great night, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.